The Kentucky Derby Trail moves from the Southwest Stakes to a little cross-country action. Stay tuned for this week's episode of Kentucky Derby Prep Briefing. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Trust the Profits YouTube page. My name is Colin Sheehan, and this is the Kentucky Derby Prep Briefing Show, a show I started back in September. That's right. We've been sticking along the Kentucky Derby Trail since September, giving you a update on what's happened on the previous weekend's race and what's to come in the next weekend's race. So we've started to move this show a little bit towards the middle of the week as we get into more heavy action on the Kentucky Derby Trail. I taped this on Wednesday, February 1st, and tomorrow, February 2nd, Bob Baffert has a case before a federal judge explaining why he believes his suspension should be lifted at CDI tracks, which was a 2-year suspension, which makes him ineligible for the Kentucky Derby this year and ineligible for Kentucky Derby points in the prep races that are happening. Owners of horses that they want to run in the Kentucky Derby and earn those points need to make a decision by February 28th to move out of the Bob Baffert barn if they want to qualify for Kentucky Derby points. At this point, to be honest, I kind of just want Bob Baffert to be back in the Derby because, listen to this, if they lift the suspension and allow him back into the Kentucky Derby, CDI would have to reallocate all the Derby points retroactively earned so far on the Kentucky Derby Trail. And based on the stuff we've seen over the course of the last week, and I won't get into much details, as Matt DeSantis said, you can read between the lines with the horse under the Jamie Ness barn this past weekend. What are we doing? So let's just move on. Let's move on from this. And I would like to see the chaos that ensues with the Kentucky Derby leaderboard if that were to happen. And that would then make this weekend's Robert B. Lewis actually worth something on the Kentucky Derby Trail. We'll get to that in a minute. But speaking of that, in the previous weekend, we had the Southwest Stakes and a horse owned by Bob Baffert named Arabian Night. It was Bob Baffert's record-breaking 6th victory in the Southwest. Arabian Night looks like a legitimate Kentucky Derby threat. What a performance he put on in the slop at Oaklawn. Here is that race. He's the number 6 on the front, going 22 and then 46 second half mile. And he had Frosted Departure giving him a little bit of pressure on the outside. You see the 3 Jace's Road deciding to make a little bit of a run here before faltering. And really nobody came close to Arabian Night. This was an extremely impressive performance for a horse. His only second start. This horse has not trailed anybody in his races. He goes right to the lead. And away he goes. Watch the closer here. I mentioned it on last week's show. Red Route 1 as far back as 10 lengths. Didn't look comfortable on the slop as you see him close in there for a game second place. The pace of the race probably set up pretty preferably for Red Route 1, where you had Arabian Night setting those fast fractions up front. Probably wore out and tired some of those other horses like Frosted Departure, Jace's Road, Corona Bolt, who we will get to. And I think that the setup of the race was definitely one in Red Route 1's favor. Also the slop, maybe something that he takes to nicely. But at 15-1, for those of you that played that exact, I believe it paid $11 off the top of my head, if I remember correctly. Not too shabby, but the story of this race was certainly Arabian Night. I've already seen the comparisons out there to American Pharaoh. So what we looked for in last week's show, let's see what we learned from the Southwest Stakes, and that was, is Arabian Night another Baffert superstar? I think the answer to that question is yes. We were wondering about Corona Bolt, how he would handle the 2 turns for the first time took a lot of money going off at 5-2, really had a terrible beginning. And for a horse trying routes for the first time, not the start that you want, got a lot of kickback, just looked really uncomfortable, was pulling hard on the backstretch. I don't think, out of this race, because of the slop, he's probably the one that we really didn't learn much about. I know on the Win Play show, Matt DeSantis was quick to say that Corona Bolt really looks like a horse that's built more for sprinting. I think in the long run, I would agree with Matt. However, I'm not going to jump to that conclusion based off of this race because of some of those factors. You're also comparing him to Arabian Night, who's clearly a much better 3-year-old, and he clearly did not like the slop. So I'm willing to possibly give Corona Bolt another shot on 2 turns, maybe on a fast track, and maybe if people are thinking the way that Matt was, which I tell you is not wrong, you just might get some value on Corona Bolt, especially after all the money that he took in this race. We also mentioned about the other Cox's races. Brad Cox, the trainer, has been on a tear. He had not only Corona Bolt, but Jace's Road and Hit Show. Hit Show scratched out of the Southwest Stakes to be moved to another race coming up this weekend, which we will touch upon. So that only left Jace's Road. Showed a little run-up, as we said, outside Frosted Departure, but ended up fading to 5th place. An important thing to note about Jace's Road, though, this horse had already run over a sloppy track and did not run well. So now you've got 2 races over a sloppy track, which were not impressive. I'd like to give him another shot on a fast track. Sun Thunder had an impressive 6.5 length score at Oaklawn, breaking his maiden. Probably tough to judge when facing a true threat, but certainly not up to what we saw from Arabian Night. So legitimate Derby contender, I'd probably lean towards the word no, because you've got some other horses like Instant Coffee, Arabian Night, who we've seen who are clearly better. But Sun Thunder had a pretty good finish there at the end, finishing 4th. Arabian Night's profile, sired by Uncle Mo, Dam of Borealis Night, as we mentioned, trained by Bob Baffert. This horse now has 2 wins in 2 races, and at the bottom there, something interesting that you will see is that for the longest time, Forte, a horse that you're going to be hearing about as he returns, you saw he trained last weekend. Forte had been your favorite in the futures. This is looking at Circa. The day after the Southwest Stakes, we have a new futures favorite. That is Arabian Night at plus 650, 6.5 to 1. Clearly the horse that is on everybody's radar now. And we will see as we update our top 25 standings on Trust the Profits for the Kentucky Derby. Arabian Night is, with that performance, now the clear contender to Forte for that number 1 spot. So speaking of those standings, which we had mentioned, if Bob Baffert somehow miraculously suspension is lifted, I don't expect that to happen, but you never know, and it would be interesting to see what happens to the standings retroactively. So with the results of the Southwest Stakes, you see Jace's Road 5th place with 15 points. Red Route 1 moves up to 6th with 13 points, and over there at 16th place, you see Frosted Departure. So we move towards this weekend, and this weekend we have 3 races for the Kentucky Derby points. And as I mentioned in previous episodes, every track has a little bit of a series. This week we kick off the Gulfstream Series, which ends with the Florida Derby on April 1st, which is the 100-point race to the winner. This week, February 4th, we have the Holy Bull, and you have the Fountain of Youth in March. I always, like I said, like to look back, give a little bit of nostalgic look of what happened in last year's 2022 Holy Bull Stakes. And if you remember, that was won by a horse named White Abario, who we just saw at Gulfstream in the Pegasus, and also number 4, Simplification. Check out number 3 there, Mo Donegal, that he would come back to win the Belmont Stakes. White Abario at that time was the one that we had witnessed as being very comfortable at Gulfstream. That one thing I noticed there, you had a field of 9. This year's Holy Bull Stakes, not as bad. We have a field of 8. And I've already heard people talking about this weekend's races about being a letdown. The fields aren't as strong. And I always like to caution people against that early in the season. Sure, it's not strong because you don't have the horses that the big names on that list that we saw, the Fortes and the Instant Coffees. And last week, Southwest, we had Arabian Night. So just because it's one horse, that means the race is really strong. You don't know what you're going to see in these races. There's 3 horses in this race that have caught my eye that I'd be interested to take a look at. Cyclone Mischief, number 4 for Dale Romans and Tyler Gaffleone, finished 7th in the Kentucky Jockey Club. That was behind Instant Coffee. And you think 7th, wow, poor performance. Pay attention to how far back, only 2 3/4 lengths behind Instant Coffee. Remember, in that race, it was a charge home at the end, a cavalry charge, which Red Route 1 was behind that wall. And so Cyclone Mischief is one of the horses that I am interested in looking having a better eye at. And he has a win over the Gulfstream Park Surface. Legacy Isle, you're number 6 there with Luis Saez aboard. Distance may be the question. Lord Miles, who is first, was 3rd in the last race that Legacy Isle won. And Lord Miles was charging on that day. Was a really late surge. So Lord Miles is a horse that I think you need to keep your eye on. Legacy Isle, as I take a look at the past performances here, had a pretty impressive race in the Mucho Macho Man. He definitely looks like he's a horse that's going to be on the front end, which suits Luis Saez pretty well. Going back to Lord Miles, pay attention that this horse now has Irad Ortiz Jr. aboard, riding for Saffie Joseph, who we all know is very strong down in Gulfstream, although maybe not so much as of late. He was coming late in that mile race, the Mucho Macho Man. This race is a mile and a 16th. I think he wants a little bit longer. They also put blinkers on. Legacy Isle, Lord Miles is a horse that I am interested in this race. Also, another horse you might want to pay attention to is the 8 Rocket Can. We did a top 5 finishes or battle stretch runs for the end of 2022, the 2-year-olds. So that Rocket Can was on that list with his battle versus confidence game. He's put up back-to-back plus 90 Brisnet speed figures. Confidence came back to run 3rd in the Lecomte. So those are 3 horses that I am pretty intrigued and interested in at watching back. Let's not just say it's a weak field. Let's watch the race and enjoy it and see who else comes out of that. We also have the Withers this weekend. Like I said, looking back at the 2022 Withers, you had the Preakness winner, early voting, and also Un Ojo, who you remember had the big upset in the Rebel. So you never know. We've just talked about the Belmont Stakes winner and the Preakness winner in these 2 of these races that were last year that we're seeing this year. Obviously, I know it's a different year, they're different horses, but that's why it's fun to look back. So you had a field of 11 last year's stakes. This year's stakes, there's only a field of 6. It's going a mile and an 1/8, 20 points to the winner, 8 points to second place. You have Arctic Arrogance, who has a pair of second-place finishes on the Aqueduct circuit in the Remsen and the Jerome Stakes. Look at number 5, the Brad Cox entry here by the name of Hit Show. Remember back early in the beginning of this show, we talked about Hit Show because he was scratched from the Southwest, and it was interesting to think or to look into was, did Brad Cox see the Baffert? Did he also have his own horses from his stable that he was interested in? And maybe that's why he scratched Hit Show to find a little bit easier of a field here. I think the race goes through number 3 and number 5, Arctic Arrogance and Hit Show. I would be more interested personally in Hit Show for that exact reason of hopefully you're seeing Brad Cox place this horse in a little bit easier race. And then we go out west to the Robert B. Lewis. The last column on your right is the trainer for each of these horses. And no, I didn't just hit copy and paste, but I certainly could have, because that's right. We have a field of 4, all trained by Bob Baffert. So in a race that should be worth 20 points, 8 points to second, 6 points to third, and 4 points to fourth place. Basically, all these horses could get points, but because they're all trained by Bob Baffert, the Robert B. Lewis will be awarding 0 points to the Kentucky Derby Trail, unless, of course, something changes on February 2nd in that court date. Let's just face it, it's disappointing to see a Derby stakes race with only 4 horses. It makes it even harder when they are all Bob Baffert trained. I think it just goes to show your options on the East Coast when you're looking at the fields and the 3-year-olds that are being entered. It's just a better option. Position-wise, you're a lot closer to a lot more tracks that you can send your horses to. You can do something like what Brad Cox did with Hit Show and move him pretty easily if you see a field that maybe you don't feel he has the best shot at. Personally, I think Newgate is the one that I would have on top here. Worcester, number 3, hasn't won, also hasn't raced at a route. It does have longer pedigree, though. The figures are a little light on hard to figure the 4, but has had really strong work, 6 of them actually, if you look back through the workout tab. And then you have Arabian Lion, who finished second behind Giant Mischief 2 back, faded to the last of 5 in a 5-horse race by 12 lengths, last out at 1 mile and a 16th. So I tend to lean towards Newgate in that race, but this is not a race I would bet. The Robert B. Lewis comes back disappointing. Also check out the undercard on that Gulfstream Park Holy Bull, because there's some 3-year-old races in there where, like I said, it's important to pay attention to the other 3-year-old races on these cards, because there are some that are talented horses in there. Tap It Thrice is a horse that the Trust the Prophets have in their top 25 who's racing. So look up and down the card for those 3-year-old races, because you'll never know what you'll see. You might see some horses that are going to be running in something like the Fountain of Youth a few weeks down the line. Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Kentucky Derby Prep Briefing. Just a quick episode to give you what's happened last weekend and the fields that are coming up this weekend. Stay tuned for Doubling Down, where Keith and I will go and try to put together a daily double utilizing that race, the Holy Bull. Matt DeSantis is obviously coming back with his Capping the Card, looking at Gulfstream full card. And the Holy Bull Stakes preview by the Formula is already up if you go through our video section. Please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for all your support, and best of luck this weekend at whatever track you're playing at.